Hi everyone, this is Nina Griffin coming to you from Los Angeles. I hope you are doing well. I received some positive feedback about my Venus and Gemini video from the other day, and I realized there were a lot of things that I could still talk about with Venus and Gemini. It seems like the appetite is there, so I'll just keep talking until I run out of material. So today I wanted to talk more about Venus's cycle, because obviously she has a synodic cycle with the sun, and the different phases of it and what they mean for this particular cycle, when they're occurring, where in the zodiac they're happening, and also, again, what they mean for you personally and what they mean for the world at large. I think the synodic cycle of the planets is something that is very important in traditional astrology, but modern astrologers really don't know it as well. I think part of that is just because we're modern people and we're not observing the sky as intently as we used to. Right? If we live in the city, you might have light pollution, but there's also just the issue of, it's just not that interesting to look at the sky when you have video games, right? There's just a lot more entertaining stuff that you can be doing. So because of that, we've lost sight of some of the key parts of the Venus and Mercury cycle. And we've lost some of that interpretive richness that comes from looking at where we are in the cycle, what's going on with the sun, what's going on with Venus, and so forth. All right, so first, let me kind of harken back and in your mind, go back 8 years. So think about what you were doing or what was going on for you in the spring and summer of 2012. The reason that this is important is that Venus's passage through Gemini and her retrograde through there was also going on at that time. Because of the way that Venus's cycle works, every 8 years, she will retrograde through approximately the same part of the zodiac that she did 8 years ago. Now, of course, this movement keeps moving forward ever so slightly, so of course she's not always retrograding through Gemini, but in our case, her retrograde in Gemini this year is very, very similar to her retrograde movement through Gemini 8 years ago. So as I mentioned in my other video, her movement through Gemini 8 years ago was like a really kind of fun, lighthearted time for me. Nothing really amazing happened that I can remember, but it was just a really positive and, social time. And the same may be true for you. Now, obviously, if you have things that are placed in Gemini in your natal chart, you might find that there were important events that Venus ended up marking through that retrograde cycle. But even if that's not the case, you might find that the general mood and feeling of that time could be repeated again this year. Now, of course, there are always other possibilities, right? You could have a different solar return this year. You might have a different set of transits, all these things that color your overall experience. But in general, I think it's safe to say that you will have a similar experience to what was going on for you 8 years ago. All right. So now let's talk about some astronomical synodic cycles and how that ties to 2020 and some of the key events that we might expect this year. So the first thing to remember is that Venus and Mercury, but I'll just focus on Venus, is like a dog on a leash, with the sun being the owner taking Venus out for a walk, right? So you can imagine that there is a maximum length of the leash beyond which Venus cannot go. She is not necessarily always with the sun, but she can't go beyond a certain distance from the sun. In Venus's case, that is known as the maximum elongation from the sun, and her maximum elongation is 48 degrees on either side of the sun. She can never go beyond that. So because of that, she can never make a square or an opposition to the sun, or even a trine, because it must be within those 48 degrees, and a sextile actually, which is 60 degrees. Because of that, when Venus reaches her maximum elongation or thereabouts, you can think of it as, this is where she starts thinking about going retrograde, approximately. So just to illustrate with what's going on now, Venus reached her maximum elongation March 24th of this year. And this is kind of an interesting thing because for a lot of people in the United States, obviously every country is different, but in the US, this is approximately the time when government started shutting down a lot of Venusian and socializing activity, if you think about it. So in other words, Venus, like a very eager dog, just ran to the end of her leash and then was caught short, right? She had to stop short. So this is what happened on March 24th. Now, because of that, Venus now starts dramatically slowing down around her maximum elongation, but the sun is still going along at his normal rate. So what happens is the sun is now faster than Venus, and he is now applying to her. Up till now, she was faster than the sun, and she was actually kind of fleeing from him. She was quicker than he was. But now the tables have turned, and she is caught short, and so now she is like the owner who's sort of walking along to catch up to his dog, who's sort of stopped, not exactly in place, but who's, let's say, moving a lot slower. So the next phase, when that happens, is Venus, of course, slows down enough that she stations retrograde. Now, this year, when she stations retrograde, well, there's a few things going on. So she stations retrograde at 21 Gemini, right? So when she does that, it means that she is going to be emphasizing and putting a lot of extra weight on degrees around that area. So for those of you who have planets or important points around 21 of the mutable signs, you're probably going to feel this the most acutely. Again, those of you with 21-degree Gemini planets will feel this most of all, but certainly even if it's in Sagittarius or Pisces or Virgo, you might feel it too to some extent. So what happens that when a planet turns retrograde, as Venus is doing, they start, we think of it as a dramatic shift in their direction of energy. Obviously, they're changing direction. But what that means in interpretation is that when a planet is stationing, it means that matters are reversing. So what that means in practice is that Venusian things in your life that you thought were going one way are actually going to be changing gears and going in another direction. Retrograde movement traditionally was considered against nature. And so because of that, planets that were retrograde or stationing retrograde were thought to be particularly unpredictable and acting in surprising ways. So if you have any aspects occurring when a planet is retrograde, those aspects are going to indicate activities or events that are just surprising and strange and out of the blue or sudden in some way. Whereas forward motion, direct motion is considered to be much more predictable, natural, smooth, that kind of thing. All right. So then after this, Venus will then proceed to the inferior conjunction with the sun, right? And so when she does that, it means that at some point, even before she hits that conjunction with the sun, she gets very close to the sun's rays. So you can think of the sun as having a zone on 15 degrees both before and after in the zodiac, where he kind of overwhelms any planets that are in that zone, right? Because the sun is so brilliant. If you put Venus or any other planet into those 15-degree zones, they will no longer be visible, right? They are literally hidden. So this is a phase known as combustion. It's also known as being under the rays. Combustion is actually 8 degrees within either side of the sun. The larger 15-degree zone is known as being under the rays. I should clarify that. But the point is that whether a planet is considered combust or under the rays, it is now hidden. Its energies can't be seen or experienced directly. The planet is disempowered. So we can think of it as Venusian activities are going to go underground. They might be hidden. Things involving women at this time might be hidden or might be closed off in some way. We can also, and this is a really interesting point, is that from a medical perspective, planets that are under the rays can sometimes show hidden issues with areas of the body ruled by that planet. So in this case, Venus are, of course, feminine parts of the body, anything to do with women's health. They're also related to the kidneys. So different parts of the body ruled by Venus can be hidden or symptoms that previously existed now go underground. There could also be a challenge if you're trying to get a problem diagnosed that is associated with Venus. It might be difficult to uncover the cause of this problem at this time, right? The other thing that I'd want to make sure that you're aware of is as Venus passes through this difficult zone of being under the beams, when she enters that 15-degree zone, which by the way occurs May 24th, and so again, May 24th is an approximation because it'll vary depending on where in the world you are and how much you can see, but you will notice that Venus is going to be particularly weakened at this time. It's that transition point from visibility into invisibility that'll be challenging. So again, be sensitive to that. Be aware that this is probably not the best date to be doing Venusian things. Again, just be aware. Then the next thing that happens is Venus conjoins the Sun. She's going retrograde, he's going direct, so they're kind of crossing like two ships in the night. And this occurs at 13 degrees Gemini. So again, it's another important point that you'll have to notice in your chart. When the two of them conjoin, if you have anything at 13 degrees of the mutable signs, you might experience it. This can be an important relationship juncture for you because Venus and the Sun, their cycle is particularly keyed into relationships. When we do horary astrology, for example, and we want to understand the dynamics and politics of a relationship, looking at the Sun-Venus relationship and cycle and where the planets are tells us a lot about what's going on in your life and in that relationship at that time and where things may be going. So as Venus and the Sun conjoin, it's a positive experience, but it can also be a traumatic one to some extent because it can indicate a transformative event. And as we all know from modern astrology, transformation is not always positive. Transformation can be very painful and very difficult. And one of the things that's important to remember is that relationships could suffer at this time. So generally, this is not a good moment, this conjunction, to really do major things pertaining to relationships. I'm sure not that you would be doing that, but I just want to point that out. So once that conjunction occurs, both the Sun and Venus are going their separate ways. They're moving in opposite directions. Venus is still moving backward, but she is now a morning star. She will now rise before the Sun. Now remember, she's still passing through that 15-degree zone on the other side of the Sun, where she is still under his beams and hidden. However, at some point, she will pop out of the beams, kind of like a basketball popping from under the water if you held it down. And when she does that, this will be around June 13th or thereabouts. And when a planet emerges from the Sun's beams like that, it is empowered. Just as a planet is disempowered when it is from, when it's moving into the beams, it's recharged and empowered and moving ready, raring to go, right? And so that's what's going to happen with Venus as she moves away from the beams. Now, again, she keeps moving, she keeps moving, she keeps moving until finally she reaches her point of her direct station, which is at 5 degrees Gemini. So that's another sensitive point, around 5 degrees of the mutable signs. If you have anything like that in your chart, you will experience perhaps a renewal or a moving forward of Venusian matters in your life. Generally, the direct station is more positive than the retrograde station. As Ibn Ezra, who was a medieval astrologer, said, a planet turning retrograde is like a person falling ill and taking to his bed, whereas a planet that is moving direct or stationing direct is somebody who's slowly starting to get better and be on the mend. It's still not the same as full health, but a turning point has been reached. And this occurs June 25th, so I just want you to be aware that this is another important turning point with respect to Venusian things. I think that overall, because Venus in Gemini is so tied into socializing and speech and communication, I think we're going to have a lot of activity around what kind of socializing is appropriate. Obviously, many of us are locked up at home. And so this whole cycle, I think looking at these important dates will correspond to important directions that we are given. How much socializing is appropriate? What kind of businesses are open? How can they operate? I think we're going to see a lot of interesting adjustment on the go with respect to connecting with other people. I don't think we've seen it as literally and quite dramatically as we are going to see it in the coming weeks and months. All right, more on Venus and Gemini in future episodes. I hope you enjoyed this one. Take care.